to a brand new episode of Law and Batting Order. I'm your host, Tony Oyakostas. Here are some quick hits from the past week. Do you remember when Cleveland Cavaliers owner Dan Gilbert wrote an open and public letter to Cavaliers fans promising a championship before LeBron James got his first? Well, that didn't happen. On Thursday, the Miami Heat brutally burned the Thunder 121-106, making this the franchise's second NBA Finals Series victory in franchise history. The star of the series was undoubtedly LeBron James, who put up impressive numbers during these past 5 games. And alas, he has silenced all of his critics after finally winning a championship in his 9th season in the league. So here at Law and Batting Order, we congratulate the Thunder on a well-fought playoff run and the Heat for becoming world champs. A verdict has been reached in the Jerry Sandusky trial, and a jury of his own peers found Sandusky guilty of 45 of 48 sexual assault charges against him. Sandusky, if you recall, was arrested in November of 2011 after it was alleged at the time that he sexually assaulted several male boys in his Penn State University charity organization, Second Mile. The material facts of the trial were disturbing, as many of the victims testified to Sandusky's actions. One of the victims even testified that Sandusky titled himself the Tickle Monster. In addition to the victims' testimonies, letters were admitted into evidence between the victims and Jerry Sandusky, revealing his emotion for these boys. This was quite a disturbing case, but justice has been served as Sandusky is expected to receive a sentence of 442 years in prison, and these victims can finally begin the healing process. Roger Clemens, one of baseball's most successful pitchers, was acquitted on Monday of all perjury charges against him. He was charged with perjury after it was suspected that he lied to Congress under oath in 2008 when he testified that he never used performance-enhancing drugs. In this trial, prosecutors called Clemens' former trainer Brian McNamee and New York Yankees pitcher Andy Pettitte to testify that Clemens used human growth hormones during his baseball career. But these testimonies were not enough as Clemens walks away a free man. And now the debate stands about whether or not Roger Clemens will enter the Baseball Hall of Fame. The answer is inconclusive for now, but there is one thing for sure, and it's that this event taints Clemens' chances of going to Cooperstown. Today's Order in the Court will be revisiting the possibility of NCAA student athletes being paid for their performance on the field or court, and also the potential for student athletes to be paid workers' compensation in the case that they are injured. For today's episode, I have the privilege of interviewing Ben Haynes, who is an attorney based in Florida, is a contributor on sportsagentblog.com and sportinlaw.com, and was a basketball player for your Oral Roberts Golden Eagles. Welcome to the program, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing well, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure. So, Ben, you actually wrote up a great article, a great mock draft. And by the way, for all our viewers, all of Ben's work will be down below in the description box. But you wrote a great article, a mock draft article on this year's NBA draft. And, you know, given that this is, the NBA draft is coming up very shortly, I thought it would be nice to squeeze in a few questions about that. So, since the NBA draft is coming up in a few weeks, actually like a week and a half, I just wanted to get your take on the draft so far. So, in the article, you mentioned, some names that are going to be picked by teams. Obviously, the no-brainer for the first pick in this year's draft is going to be Anthony Davis going to the New Orleans Hornets.
Right.
We have the second pick, the third pick, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist going to the Washington Wizards, which I think is a phenomenal pick, especially since John Wall is already in that team, and you have 2 Coach Cal products in that team. And one of my favorite players in this year's college basketball season, Jared Sullinger, potentially going to the Pistons in the 9th pick. Who's your sleeper pick in this draft so far?
Well, first I want to go and say that since my mock draft was published about 2 weeks ago, a lot's changed. Sullinger has actually been red flagged by a lot of NBA team doctors who have been contacting their front offices saying that he has a severe back injury and that he could actually even drop out of the first round now, which is a tragedy because Sullinger would have been a top 5 pick in last year's draft, and he's just so skilled. So I'm hoping his back can get better. But with regards to sleepers, I have to get 2. The first one is Damian Lillard out of Weber State. He is a point guard, about 6'3", and can really just shoot the ball. Kind of flew under the radar in college, playing at Weber State. The best school he played against last year was Cal, where he really struggled, was about 4 for 17. But last week in the NBA Combine in Chicago, he really impressed all the scouts and the front offices by he can just really shoot the ball. My second one is Royce White out of Iowa State. He's about a 6'8" forward who can really handle the rock, and scored 23 points and 9 rebounds in the third round of the NCAA versus Kentucky last year. And so those are my 2 sleeper picks for this year's NBA draft.
Really interesting picks, actually. I would never think that those guys would actually shine. But now looking at the draft class as a whole, do you think this is a really powerful draft class, or have we seen better draft classes in prior years?
To be honest, I believe this is I'm going to go on record by saying this is the best draft class since 2003.
All right, you heard it, Lawn Batting Order Nation. You heard it.
This is the best draft class we've seen since 2003, when we had the likes of LeBron, Melo, and Chris Bosh, and that was a loaded class. Now this class is loaded. The lottery, you have franchise changers and Anthony Davis, and all down the line. It's hard to compare because we really got to see how they're going to be in the league. You know, some guys are hyped up like Kwame Brown in the past, and they kind of, Darko Milicic going second pick before Carmelo. I think the Pistons wish they could get that back in 03. But it's a great draft, and just a quick fun fact for you, I have to give it for my Kentucky fans out there, being one, is that the record for most players drafted from one college in the first round is 5, set by Kentucky in 2010. John Calipari, John Wall was the first pick. He had Eric Bledsoe, DeMarcus Cousins, Pat Patterson, and rounded up with Daniel Orton. And this year they have a chance to get 6 in the first round. Darius Miller's on the border, but he could get in and give Kentucky 6 players in the first round of the NBA draft.
Very interesting stuff there. So, of course, because this is a legal show, we do have to transition to the legal aspect of the of this program. But while we are mentioning NBA rookies, obviously, when you're thinking rookies and NCAA, you naturally think of student athletes being paid for their performance on the field or on the court while they're studying. So
right.
let's start with the general question: do you think student athletes should be paid for their performance?
Well, based on my articles, I know a lot of people think I'm very anti-NCAA, anti-amateurism, but I'm not. I'm actually opposed to the pay-for-play idea. I think there's a fine line between professional sports and amateur sports. And when we talk about, pay for play, we're stepping over into the professional sports boundary. And to add to that, if they did grant pay for play, it would almost be impossible to regulate. You think about, who would even determine how much, who gets paid, who does get paid, which sports get paid more, does a quarterback get paid more than the running back? Who regulates, oversees it? I don't think there's enough manpower to do it in amateur sports. But I will go on record again by saying that Mark Emmert came out in October of 2011, and the NCAA board did grant a $2,000 stipend. It's not mandatory, but it is a possibility for schools to add. If a student athlete has a full scholarship, they can also add $2,000. Now, what's included in the scholarship is room, board, tuition, and books, and no other expenses, miscellaneous expenses. So this $2,000 stipend, which is optional by the university, could really benefit the student athlete in their college. So,
yeah, very true, actually. So the NCAA has strict regulations that student athletes can't be paid in any way, shape, and form, and we've talked about this before on Law and Batting Order. But the NCAA argues that student athletes are paid in the form of scholarship money, and we commonly see student athletes getting 4-year grants from schools to play for the school while they are getting the education. But I read an article on Slate that you actually showed me that spawned this whole conversation, that an athletics scholarship is not a 4-year guarantee, and it even says so in the NCAA handbook. And in fact, in Rule 15.02.7 of the NCAA handbook, it states that an athletics grant in aid shall not be awarded in excess of 1 academic year. So what do you think of this rule? Do you think this should be modified? What's your take on that?
Well, I will say back in November, the NCAA did approve of a potential 4-year financial aid. Now, they approved by 0.4% of the vote, so it barely passed. So now it actually is permissible to give a 4-year financial aid, which I think is great. University of Florida and Auburn has gone on record stating we're going to give 4-year financial aid to these students, but it's still not mandatory, and that's where I take issue, because the NCAA talks about, it's about the education. It's about, making sure these kids finish college. Yet at the same time, we're only giving 1 year of financial aid. And a lot of these kids are being over-recruited. The Van Treese kid in Louisville just got his scholarship not renewed. It wasn't pulled because it's only 1 year, but it wasn't renewed for the next year because he was over-recruited. Now, if we're talking, like I said, we're talking education purposes, they need to be given 4 years of that financial aid so they have security and they know where their education is going. And I can attest to the fact that I know a lot of athletes who have been in a situation where they get over-recruited, they don't find out till late July, and they're scrambling to find another school to go to try to, get support. And it really hurts kids from mid-major to even, the lower tier schools who weren't heavily recruited. They get the scholarship pooled. No one's coming after them. They're kind of stuck in a predicament. So I definitely believe that the 4 year of financial aid should be a mandatory provision given to these student athletes. I believe that there should be conditions where for cause, just like now, there should be for cause reasons that a student athlete can get their scholarship pulled, but it can't be performance based. And even now it says it can't be performance based, but after a year you can do what you want. So it is performance based, just not during the season. So I hope that they realize that if the education is the most important thing, that they will make it a mandatory 4 year financial aid.
Right. So you're actually bringing up a great point about this, mandatory versus non-mandatory condition that I'm assuming is not expressly written in the handbook. So do you expect that to be one condition that should be fixed in the near future? I know you have mentioned other sort of suggestions to revising the rule. Do you think there are any other ones that the NCAA should address to cover their bases?
I think that it's just going to be a difficult process because, like I said, if we're talking about the board barely approved a $2,000 stipend and barely approved permissible 4 year financial aid. So to talk about mandatory, to put that in the rules, I just don't see it happening. I don't see the schools agreeing to do so. And I hope that we can evolve to that in the NCAA so that we can make sure that the students who are going to school have security and are receiving the education that they were promised in high school. So.
Right, exactly. So you also wrote another article on workers' compensation recently, which was phenomenal. But you were talking about in that article how students should receive workers' compensation in the scenario that they're injured, and that it's time to revisit that idea. And it's all about basically trying to prove whether or not the player is an employee of the school. And that's pretty much one of the prima facie elements that you commonly see in these workers' compensation cases. So when you look around and you see the monopolization of these leagues, like for instance, the Big East becoming bigger, or the Pac-10, or even the SEC, just these powerhouse schools, these powerhouse leagues, just joining forces with these, sports juggernauts like ESPN, where they're striking TV deals, or where they're creating their own cable network. When you see all of those circumstances and you just take the whole thing and you mesh it together, and you realize that these schools are getting paid a lot of money, yet the player is not getting a cent in the case, let's say they have a herniated disc or their leg breaks.
Right.
In that scenario, would you expect then a lawsuit to ensue, or maybe would you expect the workers' compensation issue to be readdressed at that time?
I hope so. I definitely hope that. I don't hope an injury, but when an injury does occur, which it happens in sports often, if a severe one happens, I hope that it's readdressed in the courts, because the article that was published, I laid out the bare law of what a court should look at in an objective manner, applying the bare facts to the bare law and coming up with a conclusion. I set out many factors which were under the restatement, but the main factor the court looks at is the factor of the control that the employer has over the person you're trying to identify as an employee or an independent contractor. Any student athlete, either current or previous, will tell you that your life as a student athlete is controlled from morning to night. Almost, I'm going to say almost, because that's a key term here in a little bit. You'll see why. Almost every aspect of your life is controlled by the university or the coach. For instance, when I was playing college ball, it was class from 8 to 2, workout from about 3 to 7, dinner for a little bit, and then study hall till about 10. So about 14 of your hours were allotted for, where you sleep, where you eat, what classes you take, what time you can go to bed, where you can live. Everything is. in the most well-known case, the one I wrote about in the article, the Waldrop case, this was a player at a TCU football player who got severely injured in a football game, and he was paralyzed. It was an awful story. Lost in the trial court. In the appellate court, what the judge came up with the reasoning for the reasoning for his decision was that, and I quote, because the university does not direct or control all of Waldrop's activities, he is not an employee. And I just feel like that's some scary precedent to set when you're talking about employees, because if you're looking at just a regular old job, not even having to do with athletics, and you're applying the law, well, no employer controls every aspect of an employee's job. You don't control every second of someone's life when they're working for you. You just don't. So if that's the case, I guess there's no such thing as an employee in Texas, and there's no workers' compensation. So what they did in that case is they gave the whole amateurism spiel, which amateurism is important, but the way the NCAA defines it, I don't agree with. And so the amateurism was a big blanket, which really the judge deemed Waldrop not an employee, and therefore he was not eligible for workers' compensation. And it just really is a tragedy to see that, because like I said, if you just apply the bare facts to the bare law, there's no way you can't come up with the conclusion that the student athlete was an employee of the university. So
Right, yeah. So finally, how do you think then the NCAA will respond to the future regarding this pay-for-play debate, or whether or not they should pay a player in the scenario that they're injured? Do you expect them to stand their ground and refuse to pay these student athletes, or do you expect sort of like a revision? I mean, and just to add on to what you were mentioning earlier with the workers' comp, could potentially one fear that the NCAA have is that, let's say a player fakes an injury and milk money out of the leagues or out of the team so that they can get paid, and that could be their easy way to get paid. Do you think that's probably one reason why NCAA is so reserved in not even paying a student athlete?
Well, I'll say this. To answer your first question, I'll say that I don't believe the NCAA is going to budge on these issues. Like I stated earlier, they barely passed a vote to give a $2,000 stipend to allow for a permissible 4-year financial aid, which in my opinion should be obvious, but according to them it wasn't. So if we're talking about pay for play or deeming a student athlete an employee, there's no way. Mark Emmert has actually came out in a recent article stating, in no way is this stipend a step into pay for play. We are this is amateur sports, but I don't think that a student athlete would be able to, I don't think the NCAA is ever going to allow a student athlete to be deemed an employee, to be able to milk it, fake an injury and get workers' compensation, because I really don't. I just really don't believe that a student athlete is going to be deemed an employee of the university in anytime soon. Although I do hope that we get a judge who will look at this objectively and will deem a student athlete an employee. Not just for workers' compensation issues, but for all legal issues. And I think the NCAA is very fearful of that, because that could open up a whole nother can of worms for them.
Oh, believe me, Pandora's box would unleash at that point. But it's always interesting to talk pay-for-play, because it's always a heated debate. There's no answer, no conclusive answer, of course. But, Ben, it's a pleasure to have you on. You're always welcome to come back on the show, and thank you for being on Law and Batting Order.
All right, thank you, Tony.
Before I wrap up today's episode, I just wanted to let all of you know that my coverage of Met Social Media Night is live. If you haven't seen it yet, be sure to click the annotation on the right-hand side of the screen or by clicking the link below this video. There's a lot of great footage of the event, and I think you'll enjoy it. Anyway, that's the show. Leave all your comments down below, and be sure to visit Law and Batting Order at lawandbattingorder.com, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time, have a great week, guys.